in the late 1800s, Kansas City newspaper had a story. It was actually a practical joke. And went something along the lines of a friend sending about 5 of his other friends a telegram with the following words: "All is discovered. Flee at once." And as the story goes, the 5 that he sent the telegram to immediately fled. Both Mark Twain and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes, later used that same practical joke. And it went along this lines of, both Twain and Doyle said, "I once sent a dozen of my friends a telegram saying, 'All is discovered, flee at once.' And they all left town immediately." Right? What if you got a text message that said something along those lines? "We know what you've done. You better get out of town." What goes racing through your mind at that point? You do not have to tell us right now. You don't have to tell us. We all have that, right? We call them skeletons in the closet, right? What goes through your mind? You get a text message saying, "We know what you've done. You need to leave town." Something goes flashing through our minds. Whatever comes to mind is something we've never told anybody about. Whatever comes to mind is something that would raise an eyebrow if people knew. Something that would change our lives if people found out. We all have these in our closets. And we all have these moments. If only, if somebody were to find out. And then we fill in the blank. Creating anxiety. And you know why we feel that way? We feel that way because of guilt. We are guilty. Sometimes guilt gives us headaches. Sometimes guilt brings on depression. Sometimes it feels like we got this 100-pound weight on our chest that we would just like to push off. And the thought runs through all of our minds, when will this be over? Well, today we continue our series, The Places of the Passion. And again, we've been walking through these various places this last week of Jesus' life before he dies. And we have been following it through the eyes of one of Jesus' best friends, a man named Matthew. He's writing a letter many years later to a congregation much like this one, chronicling the life and stories and teachings of one of his best friends, Jesus. And so this morning we find ourselves in this courtyard. Jesus has gone from the Garden of Gethsemane, where he was arrested, and he is taken to the high priest's house. And so this morning we find Peter in the courtyard. Peter has followed Jesus from the Garden of Gethsemane. Now you remember, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. You'll remember that as Jesus makes his way from that room where he has spent that Last Supper with his best friends, that he has a conversation with them as they enter the garden. And the conversation goes along the lines of, Jesus quoting from the Old Testament, "Tonight the sheep are going to be scattered, and before the evening's over, you're all going to abandon me." And every one of them is saying, "Not me, not me." And guess who the most vocal one is? Peter, right? He's the most vocal. "Nope, not me." And Jesus says to Peter, funny you bring that up. Not only are you going to flee, you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. And Jesus says that he's going to bail. Well, sure enough, this conversation is interrupted. A mob shows up, mob with swords and clubs, and they are there to arrest Jesus. And the disciples all flee. They all bail, including Peter. Jesus is arrested. He is all alone. He has been abandoned by his best friends. And so much for all the bragging, so much for all the talk. Every single one of them flees into the night. Now, what's amazing about this next scene then, as we come into this courtyard after the arrest, who do we find there? We find Peter. Peter's in the courtyard. And so we begin to think, and again, if you're with Matthew's audience, you begin to think, well, maybe there's some hope for Peter. Maybe he's finally come around. Maybe Peter's going to be a stand-up guy after all. Well, here's what Matthew tells us. Those who had arrested Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had convened. Peter was following him at a distance right to the high priest's courtyard. He went in and was sitting with the servants to see the outcome. So at some point between the garden and Caiaphas' house, Peter has a change of heart. He eventually finds his way back to where Jesus is. And Caiaphas has a house big enough to have a courtyard. Jesus is inside, and we're told that the trial is already underway. Things are not going well for Jesus. But maybe there's a golden moment for Peter. Maybe Peter is going to finally come to the defense of his friend. Maybe he can make up to Jesus, him just dashing away from the garden. Well, you can't write a Hollywood script better than the way Matthew chronicles what happens next. Because not only does Peter fail to be the stand-up guy, he fails in spectacular fashion. It's all very slow. In fact, the way this is written, you can see this coming. We've already heard Jesus promise to Peter, before the evening is out, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. We can see this. We can feel this coming. And so the mood is getting darker. You can hear the music. And the music is starting that slow tone. And you know these scenes, it feels like every movie has one of these, especially those that are thrillers, where you've got this abyss, or you've got this big ravine, and across the ravine is a plank. One plank. And the camera shows you how rotting, how bad that wood is. How much rotting has taken place. And so whoever it is about to walk onto that plank. And so we've been set up, and the music begins to play. And we know the moment that foot steps on that plank, we hear that first creak. The music is getting darker. The old wood is going to give way. And here's what Matthew says happens. A servant girl comes up to Peter and says, "You were with Jesus the Galilean too." But Peter denied it in front of everyone. "I don't know what you're talking about." Man, there's that first crack. There's that first crack in the wood. The wood's going to give away. "I don't know what you're talking about." Peter's confronted by a girl who's making a connection between him and the guy on trial, the house behind him. And at that moment, Jesus is being questioned. He's being questioned by the religious leaders in Israel of the day. The trial is unfolding, and the question we're told by Matthew, the question that they want to know really is, who are you? It's a question of identity. Who are you? Who is it? And they bring the witnesses. This is who we've heard him claim to be. And Jesus remains silent as a parade of false witnesses come into the trial and begin speaking lies about who Jesus is. And that's going on the inside. On the outside, one of his best friends can't bring himself to tell the truth either. And he's having the same question put to him. Who are you? Unlike Jesus, Peter's having an identity crisis. They're both having to answer the same question: who are you? One of Christ's closest confidants is leaving Jesus hung out to dry. So Peter, having been confronted by this one, then apparently, it's interesting how Matthew describes this, he moves toward the gateway. He backs off. He's backing away from the house. He's moving toward the outer piece of the courtyard. He moves toward the gate. Well, that's when, again, another woman saw him and told those who were there, this man was with Jesus the Nazarene. And again, he denied it with an oath, I don't know the man. And again, if you're watching this scene unfold, you can hear the crack, the second crack, as the wood is beginning to give way. I don't know the man. He swears on an oath. I swear by my mother's grave. I don't know the man. And there's no doubt that fear is involved. You know, twice in these lines, you'll pick up, Jesus is identified as a foreigner. Jesus the Galilean. Jesus the Nazarene. They're casting some negative comments toward the guy inside the house and whoever's associated with him. So yes, there's fear. After all, Jesus and his best friends, they're from the hills. They're part of that uneducated place, Galilee. Those uneducated fishermen. And they are now in the seat of power with the Jewish religion. Caiaphas is the most powerful man in the Jewish religion. He is the high priest of the temple. He is the mafia don of the temple. And so Peter's being exposed as someone who's part of Jesus' company. This is all about identity. Jesus is being questioned about who he is. Are you the Messiah? Has your claim been, are you the Messiah? And outside, are you with that guy? And Peter is not true to his identity. Jesus is. Jesus is true to his identity. Peter is not. Peter is in denial, quite literally. A little while, those standing there approached and said to Peter, "You really are one of them, since even your accent gives you away." There it is again, right? Even your accent gives you away. Then he started to curse and to swear with an oath, "I don't know the man." Remember what I said about oaths? Remember what I said about oaths? God gives all those warnings in the Old Testament. When salvation is on the line, that's going to be part of the story. Warning people to make sure that you're not swearing by an oath, because you will be held accountable. And it all is landing in this courtyard on that night. Peter makes this third denial. And you know what happens, right? If we're following along with the Hollywood script, the creak, crack, the board breaks, and whoever's standing on that board is doomed to the rocks below. I mean, this really is that catastrophic for Peter. Peter is condemning himself. It says he curses himself. It's the same word used in the Bible for cursing somebody to hell. He damns himself in that moment. In that moment, unbelievably, Peter is saying, I would rather go to hell than being identified with that guy. If you had asked Peter 24 hours earlier if that would ever happen to him, if he would ever be in a position where he would deny Jesus and then curse himself, well, we know that he had been in that position. He says, no, that's not me. That's not me. You know, Peter If you had confronted him 24 hours earlier, he would have laughed in your face. He would have punched your lights out. See, Peter is all about self-salvation. He's in total denial. He is about self-preservation. What he is saying is, I don't need Jesus. I can save myself. I can save myself. I am self-sufficient. I have this. I don't need Jesus. And that's when Peter is jolted back to his senses and his whole world caves in. Peter started to curse, swear with an oath, I don't know the man. Immediately, a rooster crowed. Immediately a rooster crowed. The rooster crows. And if you know anything about roosters, that rooster didn't stop. The rooster crows, and the rooster crows. And Peter is shattered. Nowhere to hide. Guilt exposed. Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Peter weeps because that rooster is crowing the sounds of the gospel. That rooster is grace for Peter. Jesus is not going to let Peter stay in his denial. Remember last week when we talked about Jesus being in the midst of this arrest, about how he reminds everybody who's in control? A lot of times we come to this particular story, especially at this time of year, and we think about Jesus' statement to Peter, hey, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And we look at that as, oh, hey, there's a prediction of Jesus. He knows what's going to happen. I have to bring us back to this entire story. Who's in control of the rooster? Who's in control of the rooster? Who's going to make sure that there isn't a 4th denial? It's the man that's on trial for his life. And that rooster crows. Jesus is not letting Peter just sit there in his guilt and sit there in his denial. That rooster crows, and Jesus is saying, I love you, Peter. Here's grace for you, Peter. There's forgiveness for you, Peter. Peter, you cannot save yourself. You were absolutely right weeks ago when you said that I was the Messiah, the Son of the living God. You were right. And this Messiah has come to save his people from their sins. He's come to save you from your sins. He's come to save you from your denial, your sense of self-importance, your sense of self-salvation. He's come to save you. The rooster continues to crow. And you know, as that rooster crows, you know, there's always 2 things happening in this scene, right? Peter's in the courtyard. Jesus is in the house. And Matthew tells us that he's being beaten. He's being spit upon. He's being mocked while that rooster crows. And that rooster is going to crow. And Jesus is going to leave that house, and he is going to take up that cross, and he is going to go die for Peter, and die for you, and die for me. What do you do with your guilt? What do I do with my guilt? And I've got a lot of it. What if we get that message, that text message? If you're like me, you find yourself, you preoccupy yourself with all sorts of things. I mean, there are a zillion different ways that we handle guilt. Some of us medicate. Some of us medicate with the bottle. Some of us medicate with all sorts of chemistry. Some of us binge on TV. We binge with shopping on Amazon. We find all sorts of ways. Some of us even pursue the promotion. We pursue longer hours. We pursue more toys. We pursue all sorts of things trying to alleviate our guilt. For that guilt this morning, we come to this passage, and I want you to hear the rooster crowing, because it's not just for Peter. It is for you and it's for me. Jesus is not going to allow us to be sitting in our denial. He's not going to allow us just wallowing in our guilt. There is salvation. There is forgiveness. The rooster of the gospel is crowing for you and for me. Oh, it's not a real rooster. You know how the rooster crows for us? Every time we open this, every time we open the Word, every time we come to the table, the rooster of the gospel is crowing for us, providing us with freedom from guilt, with forgiveness, with life, with salvation. You see, that guilt is real. The guilt is real. We're not going to sit here and tell you that the guilt is not real. The guilt is real. Our offense, the stuff that we have done, offending our Creator, that's real. But you know what Jesus does? When Jesus goes to the cross, Paul tells us in Romans that Jesus takes our guilt. He takes our guilt. And when it's all said and done, I am no longer guilty. I am free. You are free. I'm here to proclaim to you through a little rooster who shows up in a story that Christ takes that guilt and he proclaims you to be free. Free of your guilt, free of your sin. It happens every time we open this word, every time we partake of this table. So let's do that this morning. When we leave this morning, Jesus is saying, you are guilty no more. Let's pray. Jesus, we come to you as people who know our guilt. At the same time, we hear your words of forgiveness. In those moments in which we are prone to go back and hang on to our guilt for whatever we've done, please, please, please remind us of who we are in you and what you have done for us. That you've taken our guilt and you've proclaimed us free. So when the serpent comes calling and says, guilty, we can say, no, no, no. Jesus has our guilt. Jesus has my guilt. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. In your name I pray. Amen.